Welcome. I'm Liz Taylor, ocean explorer, naturalist, and entrepreneur.
And I'm Sylvia Earle, National Geographic explorer, oceanographer, founder of Mission Blue, and an ocean melder.
Yes. This is our show, Dive In, where we host informal and open conversations with the ocean community on topics of wonder and interest. I'm going to try to share my screen.
Don't try.
Do. I know.
Yeah. Dare to be done.
Okay. Why is our
share screen?
Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh.
Gigi, can you help us out here?
Sorry?
Oh, I need Gigi to enable our screen sharing. And I'll give that a shot. But while we're working on that little hiccup, I want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. With longer days and travel kicking back in for Sylvia, it's been really challenging to schedule our dive-ins, but I'm really glad everyone is here today. And today we're pleased to welcome Jim Stevenson.
Yes, a friend of, oh goodness, I can't remember not having you as a friend, Jim. We go way back. I mean, like way back. I think I remember you as Jimmy. So that's way back.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and your name has always been very special in my family. And as I recall, you knew some of our close friends and my sister very well. And it's hard to think of you just as a marine biologist, and I'm sure that's true with my whole family.
Well, I was a student at Florida State University when your dad was the, as we called him, the ornithologist.
Ornithologist, that's awesome.
No, one of my great heroes. And it was such a lift for me as a would-be biologist to be accepted in your family and to go on field trips down those northern California rivers to the marshes and along the coast and inland. It was a different Florida when we were there years ago, 19, dare I say, 50s.
Wow.
Oh, that was a while ago.
So many of those precious waterways have been so depleted now too. It's really unfortunate.
In fact, that's the time that marks the beginning of the Anthropocene. You know, everything before was a little wilder. Everything after has been somewhat manicured by the likes of our species, but
the world is still blue.
The world is still blue and green.
My father told me a little bit about you in his class, and it seems that when you went on a field trip with them down to Alligator Point, walking along the shoreline, you weren't looking at the shorebirds that he was trying to show his students, but instead you were falling behind looking at relics of sea life like shells and things on the beach. I think he might have been a little disappointed.
Well,
she still has a really soft spot for birds, and you know, all this.
Here's an example.
During the height of the pandemic, you know, she was working on this new ocean book, and this is actually her writing muse.
How amusing.
And here he is, Mike, and you can see we do have actually a lot of bird books here in the library, but this character he's such a bad bird. It's the worst bird call, right?
It's distinctive.
Yeah.
He might join in the chorus here.
You never know. But you just think about birds and the ocean together, but most people, they look out over the water, and this is about all they see for seabirds. They might see some variety, but they don't really, a lot of people don't really know what they're looking at when they're out here. You probably look at this picture and go, oh yeah, I see this, and this.
Well, I think oceanic birds are probably the toughest birds for the birders, the life lister types of birders to get, because a lot of them involve possibly getting seasick or paying a lot of money to get out onto the ocean. And Some, like albatross, are only on a certain portion of the ocean where it's really deep and you get upwelling to bring their food to them. So it's a trick looking for oceanic birds.
Yeah.
You have to be out where they are. Huh.
And, and we really know the value of protecting flyways on the land and, the wildlife corridors. And increasingly, we're seeing the value of really protecting what are being known as swimways, these areas,
Corridors in the ocean.
corridors in the ocean. And I think it really does have a benefit to both the oceanic birds and the large pelagic sharks. A lot of people don't even think of birds as being pelagic, but they really can be.
So,
Well, there's quite a few of them that only live out on the open ocean, many of them far from the side of land. And the only time they come to land is to nest. That's the one thing they have to have land for. And fortunately, if we keep rats off of a lot of the islands in the world, it makes it more possible for them to reproduce. So we've lost some species because of rats and cats. And so I feel like we need to be stewards of the land and the ocean.
Yeah, that's all ties together. It connects everything.
that's one of the things that I think, since that view of Earth from space, to see that it all ties together.
In one of our past episodes, we talked about the horseshoe crabs and their relationship with the red knot, this little guy. So what can you tell us about the red knot, Jim?
Yeah, the red knot is, and it has various races around the Arctic, but it's a medium-sized sandpiper. It's kind of chunky, and they have a tremendous migration from the Arctic well into the southern end of South America. But they eat the larvae and eggs of horseshoe crabs. And those horseshoe crabs have been around like 450 million years. And suddenly they start disappearing because we've decided that they'd make really good lobster trap bait.
Right?
So without nearly as many horseshoe crabs, then the red knots haven't had much to eat, and they have gone from a really abundant bird to a bird, well, like it's been about 7 weeks since I've seen one, and I live on the Texas coast.
Wow.
So this is a real problem.
It really is. And, and the horseshoe crab, it's, we've talked about them before, where they, like you say, they've been around for, millions of years, practically.
400 million years.
And yet to just treat them as bait or a source for us to get their blue blood for vaccines, it just seems like so short-sighted when there's so many animals that really dependent on them.
Only 4 species of horseshoe crabs in the world.
That's right.
And in a separate class of organisms. Yeah, they're kind of special. The birds-
Meristoma, I think.
They're really cool.
Yeah. A lot of people are really afraid of them, but they're really quite harmless. You equate that tail with a stingray, but it's nothing like a stingray.
Yeah, I've never known a horseshoe crab to get stabby. They just they're just gentle, cool little animals.
Right.
I think it's hydrodynamically useful, and also it helps in terms of flipping themselves back over if they get upended.
Yeah. And it's been another thing that affects both the horseshoe crab, I think, and the red knot and other birds is really that, the overdevelopment along the coast as well, or where they put in riprap or other sort of coastal defense mechanisms, and it destroys their nesting habitat, and it makes it harder for the birds to find food as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, we do not enforce environmental laws or have environmental laws to cover a lot of the things that humans do. And we just recently missed a golden opportunity to help conservation quite a lot in Congress. And there's going to come a day of reckoning where we wish we had done some things sooner.
Yeah, I think so.
And be grateful for what did slip through in a positive way. I mean, imagine if national parks were just getting started now instead of early in the 20th century. But the foresight of our predecessors 100 years ago made some safe havens now possible. And it's our job, I think, to keep that going. The goal overall, I think that there's a growing enthusiasm for protecting at least 30% of the land and sea in the next 10 years. And the goal is related to climate. It's related to biodiversity loss. It's related to common sense. I mean, we need the planet to work in our favor. And we've just been chopping it up over the ages, so that it's really hard to find true wilderness. And it's that fabric of life that holds the planet steady. We're beginning to understand that. 30% of the land and sea in the next 10 years, right now, about half that amount of the land and a fraction of the ocean, only 3% of the ocean is safeguarded from deliberate fishing and mining and drilling and other impacts that we've come to take for granted.
Yeah.
So let's go on to something more cheerful, like seagulls.
Okay, so this is, everybody knows the seagull, but how many species of seagull are there really?
There's
Oh,
around 40 species. You'll find different sources have different numbers because people argue over what's a race, a subspecies, and what's a real species. But I think 40 is a fairly reasonable number. I think that's your western gull in California, isn't it?
Yeah, we had a dive trip going down at Catalina, and he was just
hanging out.
He was hanging out. He was just making a pest of himself. But they're so curious. In a way, they kind of remind me sometimes of the corvids in a way, because they're just like so smart and they're getting into everything and just really smart birds.
One of the things that has a lot to do with whether a species of animal survives on the planet is how well they get along with people. That's kind of sad in a way, but
Gull,
yeah,
pigeons, crows.
they do really well.
Yeah, they do. So they're really remarkable.
They feed off of our trash. It's terrible.
Now let's get into some of these birds that you send to us here today.
Yeah, there's quite a number of groups of oceanic birds, and the phalaropes are among the most interesting. This is the red phalarope, and it's one of those target birds for a lot of birders when they go to Alaska, and I run trips up there, so I get to show people a lot of life birds. And these breed up on the Arctic tundra, have tiny little golf ball sized chicks. They're just really sweet. But that's the only time they come to land. If they're going to make it as a species, they've got to survive out in the ocean, and they have to have areas that have enough food for them. And their numbers are not what they once were, but that's true of a lot of our water birds and a lot of our land birds.
Yeah.
Interesting thing about this, about that red phalarope is they are polyandrous. There's the male is not as large and pretty as the female, and the female courts the male, and sometimes more than one male, and they have several males who all think they're the father of the chick or chicks. So all those guys go gather food for the chicks. She's a pretty smart gal, but I imagine that she gets a headache once in a while from all of them.
Absolutely. And this is one I think a lot of people are familiar with, this beautiful tropic bird.
Yeah, they're in the warmer seas. There are not as many seabirds in the warmer parts of the ocean as there are the colder parts, simply because there's more life in colder oceans. But I took that off of Hawaii, which is a nice place for several species.
Getting an image of this sort with that long tail intact is a real trick. I have lots of almost pictures of these birds. You've got one that really I would long to be able to take a photograph like that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Speaking of
Another
long,
long tail. Yeah,
here's
look at this guy.
another one. Sorry, here's another one with a long tail. This is the long-tailed Jaeger, and Jaegers are, that's German for hunter. They're not a fan favorite of some of the other birds in the Arctic because they will take chicks and even bust open eggs. But they're beautiful birds. There's 3 species up in the high Arctic, and they nest and then they spend the rest of their year at sea, like the phalaropes. And so it's just another reason we should take care of our oceans.
So they feed on what, squid and small fish?
Yes, and over the sea they do. And curiously, when they're nesting in places like Prudhoe Bay or Barrow or somewhere in Alaska, they their diet completely changes to lemming and small birds. I've seen them catch long spurs and savanna sparrows, and those poor little birds have no defense against a hunter like this with this kind of speed and agility.
Yeah, they're just, it's like an air cheetah.
Yep. Maybe they'll go after a lionfish.
This beauty.
Yeah, here's another one. This is the one that looks like its wingtip was dipped in ink. This is a kittiwake, and they have a tremendous range, and they're quite pelagic after they nest, but they nest up on rocky ledges and places that are real hard for most predators to get to. There's some avian species that can give them a hard time, but there's 2 species of these all around our Arctic.
So you take trips from one end of the world to the other, don't you, Jim?
Yeah, we just did our first Antarctic trip a couple of years ago. Of course, that's where that snow petrel flew past the back of the boat and nearly dropped my camera trying to get a picture. But anyway,
what a
beautiful bird.
Yeah, absolutely.
So well camouflaged against that ocean with the little white caps and so forth.
That's true. And when they're sitting on ice and sometimes snow on the ice, they just about disappear. And in fact, we humans are smart enough that we can recognize an eye, but I wonder if sometimes skuas down there who are like large Jaegers actually can see them very well, because I've seen them fly right past them sometimes and not go after a fish or something. So
Wow.
that's a great cryptic coloration there.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, this is the famous one that has the longest migration of any bird in the world. This is the Arctic tern, and they breed from the subarctic all the way to the high Arctic as a circumpolar breeder. You see the blood red bill all the way to the tip. That tells them from any other terns that you might confuse. But they actually fly all the way down the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, crossing the equator at the halfway point and reaching the Southern Ocean. And in winter plumage, they spend several, I guess 5.5 months in the Southern Ocean before it's time to go back and do it all over again.
Wow.
I mean, how do you pack that much energy in such a little package? And how do they, I mean, people talk about bird brains. This bird must have a pretty good brain to be able to navigate.
Certainly to navigate. I totally agree with you. And they are built for flying. If you see one, you're really struck by how long the wings are and how much distance they cover with each flap. And of course, they're relatively thin birds, so they're light. That's why you see the really short legs.
Yeah, look at the red feet.
If a bird has short legs, it either means that he's trying to conserve heat and be a lighter bird. And of course, being in the Arctic, you have both of those reasons there.
And the Antarctic for this one.
Yeah, then there is actually an Antarctic tern as well, but like a number of birds that evolved from northern species, they have not crossed the equator. The Antarctic tern, which is also a beautiful bird, is down within about 1,000 miles of the Antarctic. And the curious thing is, when you go down there in December or January, the Antarctic tern is in its breeding plumage, but the Arctic tern is in its winter plumage.
Wow.
So it's really easy to tell them apart.
And then right here at home, we have the least tern that's just showing up now. So that's another one coming through.
So
Yeah, they've faced a lot of difficulties, and probably no worse than on the Mississippi River, where they nested historically on the little mud and sand bars, and now that's been those aren't hydrodynamically feasible, so they were taken out in most places, and that was leaving the tern with no place to nest.
It's so short-sighted.
Yeah.
Look at this guy. These are some of my favorites. Beautiful.
Yeah, that's a wandering albatross, and they glide sometimes, it seems, for hours without a wing flap. They don't even fly much on the few days where there is no wind, but I believe their most common latitude is what we call the roaring 40s. I'm sure you could talk all day about this, but I think it's because there's so much wind at that latitude, and that's probably why they evolved, is the wind was helping them with their flight, and they could get quite large. Yeah.
There's few things sadder than watching an albatross like trying to land or take off, right? They kind of like come in and it's like they crash, or they're running and then they just try to fling themselves off a cliff and grab the wind.
are these the ones with the longest wingspan, Jim?
Well, not really. The wandering and the royal albatross average around maybe 10.5 to 11 feet wingtip to wingtip. Actually, they're slightly edged out by the Andean condor, which of course uses a lot of wind too. And plus you get a lot of thermals that are coming up the Andes and other mountain ranges in South America. So this is basically a water condor. I mean, there's so much similarities in their flight pattern and whatnot that it's really interesting. But these guys feed, they have an awful diet, you might say. They feed on the dead stuff that sinks to the bottom of the ocean and then eventually rises to the surface. And it's called offal. I think it's OFFAL.
Right, it is.
Yeah, and so these guys pick it up, and I don't think it's a diet that humans would care for very much, but it keeps them going. And there's some other seabirds that eat that too.
Yeah.
But humans have a taste, some of them, for Limburger cheese. And I mean, like, wow.
But it's another reason that, like, the albatross in particular are really at risk from a lot of the things that we put into the ocean. We've seen some of the images of them where they go range far and wide to bring back food for their chicks, and then they're feeding them plastic, they're feeding them, lighters and toothbrushes and all manner of stuff bottle caps that we've just put out there into the ocean, and they mistake it for food.
Yeah, as someone who tries to help the birds along the coast, I can tell you that the number one culprit is fishing line. And to their credit, some of the groups like Parks and Wildlife in Texas here have put little like cans that open where you can put old fishing line, and that helps a lot. But boy, it's just nothing sadder than to see a bird that's permanently damaged from junk that we leave around.
Right.
Yeah.
So senseless. Oh, look at this little dude.
Well, that's the Antarctic petrel. That's the southernmost flying bird in the world, and it's one I really looked forward to seeing when we went down. And they were pretty hard to find, but I got about 5 or 6 and got some pictures to share of them. These birds are like medium-sized albatross, and actually this is a little smaller than medium-sized, but there's other species that are much more common, but this is the real gem of the group, I think, for the birders.
Just a beautiful bird. And how do they handle being out on the ocean all the time for dealing with the salt?
Well, they have, I think they're called nares.
Mhm.
I haven't done any studying for this, but I think they're called nares, where they release salt out of a gland at the base of their bill. But your point's well taken about the difficulties that salt can cause not only animals but plants too. Our the wonderful plants we see along the coast, like juncus and spartina and things like that, uh, they can't put a lot of energy into reproduction because they have to spend so much energy on pumping the salt out of their roots.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Strategies. Oh, like this, like a little pigeon.
Yeah, this is another one that's rarely seen out of the subantarctic regions. Um, this is a snowy sheathbill, and there's one other species of sheathbill, but these are not closely related to other birds. But these are essentially vultures. They're just
Wow.
white, but the bill is actually not unlike a vulture. Um, and if the legs were a little longer, that would be the case too. And this is a really important job for things like coyotes or birds that are scavengers, or other animals. There are some turtles that are scavengers, like sliders. They are recycling nutrients, and we don't want to run out of nutrients on this planet. So
Wow.
they're awfully important.
So this bird is more of a land bird, isn't it, than a seabird on the Antarctic continent?
It's comfortable in the Antarctic, which is, of course, land surrounded by water. So they can go either way. And of course, you can tell from their color that they spend a lot of time on the snow and the ice.
Yeah.
I've seen, I wonder, what do you think of some of the hens around the, with white plumage? Do they know?
Well, I think when you're talking about artificial selection, we can breed birds for whatever we want them to look like. They may not always appreciate that, but I think if you turn a hen loose in the wild and you turn, this white, and then you turn a regular chicken that's brown, it's going to have a lot better chance of surviving if it's brown or gray or something than white.
Yeah.
That would be like the all-time worst color to be in the woods.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And they don't really favor cold weather very much. So
No. But it is really interesting because kind of like you were talking about being similar to a vulture. I noticed this guy doesn't have that much facial feathers either, like around the eye and so forth. It's
yeah,
a little bit barefaced.
That's exactly right. And of course, naturally, there's a good reason for that. It's less chance of getting body fluids from the creature that they're feeding on onto their feathers. And that's why vultures have bare heads. Caracara, most of the species of caracaras, which are kind of a hawk trying to be a vulture, have bare faces as well. So nature takes care of these problems.
can these little birds swim?
Yes, they can, and the vast majority of birds that live around the water can sit on the water, but some of them don't. Plovers and sandpipers rarely light on the water, most species, but they are capable of it. It's been suggested that the smaller ones can be taken by fish fairly easily. So it's probably better to be on land so you can get run over by a four-wheel drive or something.
Yeah.
Kind of get that rundown feeling.
Yeah. And of course, the beautiful penguins.
Talk
Yeah,
about adaptations for the sea.
they really are. They have more, well, in fact, every square millimeter of their body is covered with feathers. And they're, I think, the only bird that doesn't have feather tracks are penguins. So they are supremely adapted for life in the ocean. And of course, they can't fly. They have flippers for wings, But the really interesting thing is if you go to Alaska or some of the other areas in the far north, there are puffins and a number of other birds in that same group that we call alcids that are really an incredible convergence with penguins. But they evolved in the northern high latitudes, and penguins, of course, evolved in extreme southern portions of the earth. But it's amazing how similar they are, even though they're totally dissimilar in their evolution.
The great auk looked remarkably like the penguin. Of course, they're all gone.
Yeah, sad but true.
Oh, how
These
could
are
you not-
adorable. Little
Yeah,
chin
this
strap.
is the little chin strap penguin. And there are places where you would never believe penguins were in trouble because of the numbers that you see. There are just places where there are thousands of them in the colonies. And they have a very important job of getting those eggs laid and getting the chicks on their way before the winter comes back. If people think that North America has bad winters, they should try the Southern Hemisphere. It
Oh,
is
yeah.
much colder, as you well know, Sylvia. It's much colder down there.
And dark.
Well,
And this cold. Yeah.
Really do.
right, but I mean in their summer, you know, November,
cold.
December, January, it's colder than at the same latitude in our summer, like June, July, and August. It
Yeah.
is disproportionately colder down there.
It's the coldest, driest, windiest continent on the planet.
Colder than my former classrooms on exam day.
Or the heart of the professor.
The heart of, yeah. Colder than the
Except for his
professor's
head.
heart. Yeah. So, you know, this is kind of one of these keystone species, you know, these krill that seems like they're so important to a variety of ocean animals, fishes, marine mammals.
Squid, everything.
Yeah, and they're really important to many of the seabirds as well.
Mhm.
But they're another animal that seems like it's in real trouble mostly from fisheries, thinking that there's an overabundance of krill that's just there for the taking. But we're also seeing some impacts from climate shifts as well on these guys, changing their migratory routes.
And the amount of sea ice.
Sea ice, and then you're talking about puffins. You know, that's another bird that I recall reading about, some of them actually going through periods of starvation because they can't find sort of the right size fish that is appropriate to feed to their chicks
In the northern hemisphere.
in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah.
But this whole thing of, you know, again, it's this whole global shift that we're seeing of, you know, some seas getting warmer and animals going deeper to avoid the warm water, or they're changing their entire migration routes.
Yeah, I think a lot of people that I've talked to in Audubon societies and places like that don't understand the scope of the problem, because the problem is that things are changing so fast.
Yeah.
You might think, well, animals adapt, right? Well, that's not true. Some animals can adapt faster than others, but we have changed the planet so much in just 50 years that numbers of shorebirds, for instance, numbers of a lot of our migratory songbirds are 60% less than they were like 30 to 35 years ago. And you get a different number with every set of research, but it's always between 35 and maybe 50% of what we once had. And if that happens in just 25 or 30 years and we don't get a handle on this, we're going to be looking at global extinctions beyond our wildest imagination.
Yeah.
Part of the problem with these disturbances, the disruptions in the ancient rhythms and ancient food webs, is that we have intruded on them, taking krill by the ton and small fish. Again,
Bait
not
fish.
just
This is
not just by the
terrible.
ton, but by thousands of tons, millions of tons of the very creatures that are linchpins for the whole web of life on Earth, certainly in the sea and in the air. When the krill are depleted, it just disrupts the entire system. And it's true with small fish that have been mined to feed cows and chickens and pigs and
The
cats and
menhaden.
dogs. And
The menhaden.
menhaden is another example,
Yeah.
right? There
Sometimes
really
I
is
think,
this.
I'm sorry, sometimes I think that we look at nature shows, which I think is basically a good thing and fantastic photography. But it shows these huge schools of krill or whatever, and it gives people kind of a false security about the ocean. They don't realize that, you know, there are pretty fair portions of the ocean that are proverbial deserts. And you know, we worry about all these other human things from disease to whatever, but we're going to be in a lot of trouble if we don't pay more attention to the environment and the animals and plants that we're losing.
Here, here. And this beauty?
This is a skua. It's one of several species of skuas, and these are kind of overgrown Jaegers, and they really have an important place in nature because they're the ones that will take out the sick and wounded and diseased young birds or adult birds that have already wounded themselves somehow. And they really keep disease from running rampant in these colonies where there's thousands of birds all massed together, which is a prescription for disaster in itself.
Right.
But some people go in and look at these skuas, you know, killing some baby bird or something, and oh, it's a terrible bird. But boy, they're like vultures. They're really have an important role out there in nature. Oh, there's one. He's advertising his territory, and he's basically saying, "You don't want to mess with me," and he's right.
Yeah.
Not with a bill like that.
How big are
Yeah,
these guys?
That's a South Polar skua right there. I recognize that one. And there are 4 or 5 species, and they all have a bill built very similar to the hawks we have in North America. And they really know how to use them. They can actually catch some of these fast flying terns and other birds with their bill in the air.
Wow.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And are they kind of roughly the size of what we normally think about as a hawk? Are they bigger or smaller?
No, you're right on target with that. About the size of a medium-sized gull, maybe the size of a ring-billed gull or something.
Yeah, so pretty formidable.
Yeah.
It's a good thing they're not bigger. We might have trouble. That's great. So I know that, you know, when you're taking groups out into the wild and out to see the different birds and things, they come back time after time, year after year on trips with you, you know, and maybe even looking for specific birds. And we're seeing more of that happening in the ocean too. This is a wreck fish that lives down around the dive park at Catalina Island. And, you know, he's really distinctive. He's an individual, just like some of these individual birds. And it's been a really good thing to see, you know, more people starting to look at fish as the birds of the sea, and to start
Fish watchers.
Fish watchers, yeah. And I think it's really interesting that we're seeing people, you know, getting below the surface to kind of better understand some of the relationships between the birds and the fish, and understanding that when we have kind of healthy bird populations on some of these little islands and things, that bird population, all the guano that they're depositing there, it's really kind of feeding that micronutrient loop that you were talking about before.
Which reminds me, Jim, of this book that you wrote called Quest, Bird Watching, looking around the world. I mean, I long to see a book like this about fish, that you could do the counterpart in the sea. How many kinds of birds are there? How many kinds of fish are there? Could you really aspire to see them all?
That's a possibility. It would be, I guess, pretty expensive to see all, 21,000 species of bony fish, I think it is. There's only a little less than 10,000 species of birds. So the ichthyolisters would have a definite advantage. But I think what you're saying is really good. And I would like to believe that bird listing and bird photography for sure, which is coming on like gangbusters these days, will prick people's consciences to where they might actually vote for a candidate who cares about the environment or who doesn't want to see, bald eagles disappear or whatever. So,
Yeah.
and then that could transfer to the ocean if people start realizing, and just diving on a coral reef. I mean, something you've done 16 trillion times, but I'll bet when you're on coral reefs, you see something new and interesting almost every time.
That's exactly right.
But it really, again, points back to like how vital on a coral reef, how vital things on the land are. So you have like you have a bird rookery in a mangrove forest. And again, that habitat, both for the birds and for the baby fish
and the nutrients.
And the nutrients, they're just like so intertwined like this. And there's nothing kind of cuter than a baby barracuda hanging out in the mangrove.
This is a baby egret.
Yeah, or baby egret. Yeah, baby pelican. Baby
Yeah,
booby.
we have an interesting example of that in my yard, which I'm sitting here facing right now. My yard has the highest yard list of birds in the history of North America. It's 324, I guess. And for the first 4 years, there were no cardinals here, if you can believe that. I know you're in California, but most of the country has cardinals, and people would come here and see all these buntings and orioles and grosbeaks, and then somebody would say, "Where are the cardinals?" Well, after 5 years, a pair of cardinals moved in here. And of course, I named them after my parents because the first thing they started doing was making babies. And I named them Henry and Roosevelt. And people know not to make fun of either name because that's my parents. But so ever since then, I guess for the last 22 years, we've had cardinals in the yard. And I'll tell you what, I don't study those cardinals. I don't evaluate their movements. I love those birds. And that's what we need people to do is not just study the ocean or eat seafood. We need to get people to love the ocean and to see that, it's as important to us in a lot of ways as our parents, because if we're going to sustain ourselves, we have got to have the ocean, and our land has got to be usable for our purposes as well as animals around us. And I think most people just aren't serious about the planet right now.
Yeah, true enough. It's frustrating to see, just going into any home improvement store, and just like tub after tub of Roundup and perfect lawn stuff. And you really have to think, like, what are they thinking? When you can do so much more by rewilding a yard or, planting native plants. We had the Homegrown National Parks program in December and talked about, how valuable it is to plant an oak tree, versus an ornamental tree. That it just supports so much more.
I'd love to see your yard with that great collection. I want to know what caused Henry and Roosevelt to move in.
Well, probably the greening of the island. This island on Galveston was at one time just grass. That was the ecosystem on much of the coast, in fact, and it's like tundra in Alaska. But as people were here and started planting trees and stuff, we got more forest birds and fewer grassland birds like meadowlarks. But right here in my yard, in order to build these lakes that we have here, they took tons and tons of dirt back in the early 50s and piled it up to where it was about 14 feet above sea level. Wow. And up there's not as much salt air. And consequently, the trees started to grow just from an acorn dropped here or a pine seed or whatever. And now it's like an island out in a grassland desert. And there's nothing wrong with grassland, don't get me wrong. That's the native ecosystem.
Yeah.
But these birds that pass through get a lot of nutrients from my yard in the form of fruit. And of course, I've got water here for them. I've got a drip. And people who are watching, keep your bird baths clean. A lot of birds die from dirty water, and it can be avoided so easily. So your yard, who's ever listening, your yard can add so much to the possibility of birds and other animals surviving into the next century. And it's more than birds too. Snakes and lizards and toads and frogs and salamanders and
Insects, yeah,
oh
everything.
yeah, absolutely.
And this is an example of the kind of one of our home rewilding projects down in Florida. And we were so happy to see these blue-winged teal coming back to the pond.
It's just a little body, a little lake, a mini lake. But
Yeah.
like your yard, it's just astonishing when you give back even a little bit, nature thrives, and it's so satisfying.
So yard by yard, we can do this.
Yep.
That's right. And I think that people are drawn to, some neat bird. I don't know how many birders that I've taken on field trips, just in casual conversation, I'll ask them, how did you get started birding? And probably 2/3 to 3/4 of them will say, just looking at birds in my backyard or
Yeah.
my bird feeder or something like that. So yeah, I would really encourage that.
Easy to get hooked.
Yes.
Yep.
And, another thing that we can do, I mean, more things that we can do to help birds, I think, is just getting out and doing these beach cleanups. I was out with another dive group down in Monterey recently, and this gull was aggressively going after this old discarded mask on the beach. And you think about something like this, it could, get around his neck, around his foot. There's any number of ways he could become entangled just because they're so curious. In the same way, a fish could get entangled in this as well.
So you shushed them away.
Yeah, I shushed him away and I, picked this thing up and put it in the trash.
Yeah. I wish all birds had the survival ability of gulls. Boy, it's hard to get rid of gulls. Not that you want to get rid of them, but they have a way of surviving around us that's up there with, mockingbirds and pigeons. We're like their best friend.
Yeah, so we encountered this one that wasn't so fortunate. And alert, anybody that is squeamish, you can look away for the next slide.
Well, yeah.
But this guy, hung up in fishing gear, to your point, about how dangerous that can be. This one got hooked up in this like treble multi-piece lure, and like through the beak, through the foot, into the chest. And, we don't know what eventually happened to him, but he, seemed like he probably just fought and starved to death.
Yeah, it's important to understand that this is not natural selection.
No.
This is artificial selection. This is humans, and we don't have the wisdom to pick which animals should live and which animals should die. And it's really troubling to me how we play God on this planet instead of sharing the planet with other living creatures.
There's nothing in the history of these animals that prepared them for predation and the junk on the scale that we have imposed. And Jim, it's mostly since the middle of the 20th century, partly our numbers, but also we've developed these products like the lightweight and synthetic durable materials, fishing gear, that there's just nothing in history that enables, whether it's fish or birds or marine mammals, literally more than 300,000 marine mammals die from entanglement in fishing gear every year. And birds, I think it's the #1 killer of albatrosses.
The long lines.
The long lines getting entangled in fishing gear. it's just inexcusable. We must do better.
And I had to put this picture of an osprey in because I just think their opposable ankles are so cool.
It's interesting to me that he's carrying, or she is carrying, this rod like they carry a fish when they've caught it.
Yeah.
They have to point the fish's head straight ahead, or it slows them up too much and they'll go into the drink. But this animal may, I mean, you have to understand, these are not Einsteins with feathers. And this bird may for a while think that it's got some kind of fish there. When you think of how thin and long and hard some kinds of fish are, it's really sad.
Yeah. Yeah. He's got like I don't know, it's like a twig or something. I don't know if he's taking up for nesting material or what he's doing here, but yeah, you've seen him with the fish where they turn the whole fish so it's aerodynamic with them.
That's right.
We're going to move on to some questions and answers now.
But also, Jim, I'd like for you to talk about your books. Well,
Yes,
we're waiting
please.
for people to line up here.
And I try to stop
I've only
sharing.
got
Well,
3 out.
I've got, I guess, 11. The newest ones, I've written a book on how to find birds in Costa Rica with about, I guess, 300 pictures I took in Costa Rica. And people want to go to foreign countries and see their birds, but a lot of times they don't know where to go and who to meet. And so this is all about the places and the birds there. And I'm really pleased. It's just come out and it's selling all over Costa Rica. And I'm excited about that. But I also have Birds of the Gulf Coast. That's the first book on birds of the Gulf Coast. Most of our field guides are like all of North America or something. And this allows people in the Gulf region to have something that really applies to their area. And of course, you can go into greater depth with that. And I have a Bird Life of Galveston for people who want to come to the upper Texas coast and see these delicious warblers and other kinds of birds that we have migrating through. That's a pretty cool thing. I think that one thing scientists and other people who learn a lot about whatever really should do is to find some way of putting their knowledge into a book or a website or something like you have done, Sylvia. I loved your books, because we unfortunately won't be around forever. But it's almost a kind of immortality, but it's also a service to the planet to have what we know in some intelligible form there.
Here. I was motivated myself by a book, William Beebe, Half Mile Down. Caught my imagination as a kid, and it's still there.
Still there.
I want to go onward and downward, as well as anywhere else that there are fellow creatures to explore. So,
And your newsletters, I look
Yeah.
forward to receiving that every once in a while when you put those out. It's got such great information, and you've got what, a couple thousand followers there now, right? Eh?
Yeah, people really enjoy that because it teaches them North American birds, and it gives them 4 or 5 lines about each bird and maybe some interesting anecdote. Anyone who wants to get on that can email me. It's the Galveston Ornithological Society, but you just use the first 3 letters, GALORNSOC@earthlink.net, and just write, and I'll be very happy to put you on there. It's free. Nobody gets your email, and I'll guarantee you'll learn a lot about birds.
You really do. It's a great resource. Okay, we've got a couple questions. Let's see. For Jim, is there any hopeful update for the seagull regarding the E. coli wasting that we're seeing along the California coast?
Well, not being in California, I can't say for sure, but one of the good things about birds is that they are, at least in theory, protected by state and federal laws. And I think you have a pretty good state agency there. So I would guess, and I'm only guessing, living in Texas, that they're on it. But call the state people particularly and ask them what's going on, and hopefully they'll give you an answer that will make you happy.
Yeah. And I think it really speaks to some of the things that we're putting into the ocean, that there's even going to be an E. coli outbreak, because, we see so much, spilled sewage and other contaminants that come downstream and end up on the shoreline where these birds are feeding. And to your point about keeping the bird bath clean, we need to keep our beaches clean and the oceans clean as well.
Absolutely.
The big bird bath, right? Okay. Are there similar threats facing any of these birds that you've shown us today, or are the main threats then primarily human-induced: plastic pollution, loss of food, and loss of nesting grounds or habitat? What are the biggest threats that can be realistically done, or what are the biggest threats and what can be realistically done to help alleviate these threats?
Well, when animals can't reproduce, it's a bad omen. And the islands where these seabirds nest, and most seabirds, I think, nest on islands and not mainlands. When they get infestations of Norway and black rats, it's the beginning of the end for them. And there are other places, like on the Galapagos, where house cats became really prevalent, and I think the government has done what they can with that. But you have to make sure birds are able to reproduce. Without that, they're not going to make it. But there aren't a lot of birds out being shot or hitting glass windows or hit by cars or things. Those oceanic birds are out over the water. So if you can get them to adulthood, provided fish numbers and other marine animals stay up, they're going to be okay. And I think a lot of our oceanic birds are doing okay. I mean, there are literally millions of some species out there. So we just have to make sure they're able to reproduce.
Yeah.
That they have enough food to stay strong enough to be able to do what it takes to make more birds. I mean,
Right.
The squid fleets are
Visible from space.
making huge inroads in what would be a normal source of sustenance for seabirds and for life in the sea as well, marine mammals included. It goes through the whole food chain. And the small fish that are just ground up, they're called trash fish, but they're not trash. They're just used for fertilizer and food for farmed animals or domestic animals, including cats and dogs. So we're taking such a big bite out of the ocean that it really is having an impact on the animals that have no choices. We have plenty of choices about what to eat.
Well, I don't want to say anything too controversial, but some of these things are, since when did that start? Some of these things really are symptoms of a greater problem. During the Civil War, the human population hit 1 billion, and now it's close to 8 billion. And anytime a species reproduces like that, 160 years, we have 8 times as many people. That's going to have ripple effects, especially as a top level consumer all over the planet. And that's what we're seeing here. Why do they take these little fish and use them to make plants? Because there's all these people that have to eat. And we have got to deal with that population problem. Everything else we have, the three of us have said, are certainly true. But that's a biggie.
It's underlying many of the other issues, just our sheer numbers.
So we're at the top of the hour, but do you have time for a few more questions, Jim?
Of course.
All right, we'll keep going for a couple more minutes. And
Sure.
Victoria's asking us, what is the rarest bird you've ever seen?
He looks in the mirror, that's where it is.
I think a bird that has really stuck in my mind and Sylvia alluded to a book I actually wrote 22 years ago on the quest for 5,000 birds, which is kind of old news. But I searched and searched for much of the day in the Tepui Mountains of southeastern Venezuela, and my life list stood at 4,999. And late in the
Man.
day, I heard a bird back in the woods, and I squeaked a little bit to try to get it out. And there it was. It was a bird I really didn't think I would ever see. It was a scarlet horned manakin. And as
Wow.
I was looking at it, a female popped in, and immediately the male's horns went up in the air like that, causing all kinds of remarks by the people I was with. But that was number 5,000, and it may not be the rarest bird I've ever seen, but it was rare and certainly very satisfying.
That's so awesome.
Number 5000.
Yeah, you can guess who was buying the dinners that night.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Jenny is asking us, what role does the decline of insects all over the world play for birds? My impression is that the chorus of bird voices at dawn has gone much quieter, while simultaneously I see much fewer insects. Just how much of an influence does it have on the life of birds?
Well, it's a tremendous influence. And one of the big reasons is so many of our songbirds and some other groups of birds need protein from the insects that they eat in order to make viable eggs. There are a lot of seed-eating birds that will eat seeds maybe 9 or 10 months out of the year. But when you get to May or June, they leave the seeds behind, and hummingbirds also do this, so that they can eat proteinaceous food that will nourish their eggs. So I would say insects are a huge friend to birds. And of course, they're eaten all year, but especially in the breeding season. And like I said, if something affects the reproduction of an animal, that's hitting it in the very worst place.
Absolutely. And I love your point about the hummingbirds, because I've watched them. You know, out here we have these pine beetles that are attacking the big Monterey pines. You can just see them kind of swarming around the tree, especially if there's been like a fresh cut or a broken branch. And the hummingbirds just come in and they're just like ping, 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 just picking off those little boring beetles, and they'll eat. I've seen them going after gnats and mosquitoes. You know, when we talk about mosquito control, we don't really think about hummingbirds, but I've seen them eat those guys too. So it's remarkable.
Imagine if you're a mosquito and a hummingbird comes at you. It must really be terrifying.
Right? There's no escape.
You probably don't know what hit you.
No.
Hummingbirds fly pretty fast. They pick birds out of the air even faster than kiskadees and other flycatchers and swallows. They just go across the Gulf. Sometimes they're 30 minutes in my yard before any other songbirds make it across the Gulf. So they're quite great flyers.
It's
They're amazing.
500 miles, isn't it?
It's over 700 from the northern tip of the Yucatan. And that's largely
water.
Sorry?
Across open water.
Oh, absolutely.
That's
And
tiny
the,
little hummingbird.
Yes, ruby-throated hummingbirds. I'm basically in the east because I'm on the Texas coast, and that's the only species of hummingbird we have. You guys out west have about a dozen. So
Yeah, we got
I
a
envy
bunch
you.
of them. Yeah.
But what a power pack to zing across 700 plus miles of open water. They must be exhausted by the time they find your backyard.
Well, it makes a good argument for trying to have a place where, I mean, birds basically need three things. They need a place to rest, they need water, clean water, and they need food. And if you can give them those three things, they recoup their lost energy and they're on their way. You know, migration is a very important thing for birds because it is an agent of natural selection. And if you find a dead bird on the beach that didn't make it across the Gulf, in a way, that's sad, of course. I mean, we should always care about life, but it doesn't bother me as much as if I see a bird smacked on the highway, because
Yeah.
we did that. And that bird might have had the best genes in the world, but maybe they didn't have their lights on in low light like so many people in Texas do. And it's unfortunate. They think if they can see the other car that they don't need their lights on. It doesn't work
Yeah.
that way.
No, it doesn't work like that at all.
No.
Okay, this is our last question.
Okay.
Stephanie is asking, I'm getting ready to travel to the Florida Keys. Can you suggest a good place to bird watch?
Ooh.
Yes, there are some state parks listed on the internet that are really excellent. And I think the very best place is in Key West. There's right as you cross the bridge to go into Key West, off to the right, there's about 12 to 15 acres that have been set aside with trails. And it is amazing, the birds that show up there. I've taken groups there any number of times. Just go on the internet and, birding Key West, and it'll tell you all about it. Because at 69, I can't think of the name of the place. But they really provide a service, and oddly, they get Western birds there. And I have nobody has any explanation of why that happens, but it's like a bird following the shoreline and going all the way down the Florida coast, out the Florida Keys, and finally it gets to Key West, and it has no idea how it even got there or where to go. So every winter they'll get 6 or 7 birds wintering there, like black-headed grosbeaks and western tanagers and things like that.
Wow.
So that's a place you definitely want to go. But any of the state parks that have a good system of woods there, they'll have those specialties on the Keys, like black-whiskered vireos and things like that.
So I think that it's important to give a little shout out to a project in Florida that should make not just birding, but all aspects of wild Florida recover somewhat. And that is the Wildlife Corridor project that extends all the way from the Florida Panhandle down to Key West. And it's a patchwork of state, federal lands coupled with private property, landowners who have agreed to safeguard their property for wildlife. So it's really beneficial for big things like bears and panthers and bobcats. And little things like hummingbirds. Yeah.
Indigo snakes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No,
These
you're right.
precious animals that we can either take the action now while there's still time to ensure that they and we can be around together far into the future, or we're going to lose the chance. That's the sense of urgency that I think we should be inspired to do whatever we can in our backyards, and to get, as you point out, the right people in power in office who respect the importance of protecting nature too.
Right.
This is the moment.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. We really appreciate your time today and learning so much about all the birds and how they connect us all. And I want to say thank you to all of our guests that came to join us today, and our producer, the Ocean Elders. Water connects us all, especially that clean drinking water. We're so grateful to everyone. And we
It
look
was my
forward.
pleasure, and there's no family I would rather do this with than you guys, and I'm coming to see you too.
All
I
right.
certainly hope so. Well,
All right.
you can come identify some of those sea ducks that are out there on the lagoon.
Sounds good.
I want to remind
Okay.
everyone, protect the ocean as if your life depends on it.
Because
It does. It truly does. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again next time. Thank you, Jim.
Bye.
Bye-bye.